Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's the first full week of 2024, a new year, and I thought that we would have a week dedicated to some economic issues. Last week, I talked a little bit about politics and a little bit about transformation. This week, I want to focus on the economy. Today's interview with Marty Pelletier, I think, was sobering, and he did a great job of talking about how the equity markets are challenged potentially going into 2024, that technology stocks may be dramatically overvalued, that interest rates are too high, and he's hoping and counting on them coming down, but they are too high. And he talked about debt and deficit. And I think that that's something that we really need to address. And so I wanted to spend a few minutes on that. I also want to give you a sense of how I'm going to follow this up this week. Tomorrow, Tuesday, I've got Ron Butler, who is an expert on interest rates and mortgages and the housing sector. He's been involved in the mortgage business and the housing business for a couple of decades, and he lived through the 1990 collapse in the housing market in the Greater Toronto Area. And he's got some really poignant views of what's going on in the housing market, in regulatory red tape, in interest rates, and a bunch of the issues associated with affordability right now in the Greater Toronto Area, in Vancouver, in Montreal, etc. And I'm going to talk a little bit more tomorrow after his interview about affordability and the issues there. On Wednesday, I've got two interesting interviews. One with Shilpa Mishra with a really interesting discussion about raising capital for small and medium-sized companies and how challenging it is, and the process that you've got to go through to get it, and that is the heartbeat of the Canadian economy, and that given our focus in the Toronto Stock Exchange on mining and oil and gas, it's very challenging for industrial companies, for pharmaceutical companies, for healthcare companies to raise money. And frankly, that it was so easy for real estate companies in the past, not today, but in the past, because of low interest rates and the escalating home prices and condo prices, et cetera, that we sort of crowded out a lot of more productive parts of the economy. And then Alex Bishop talking about Indigenous reconciliation, which I think is a huge issue. I think in the past, Indigenous issues were something that maybe too often business sort of put up with and or didn't even put up with and complained about. And now finally people are coming to the realization, companies are coming to the realization, governments are coming to the realization that making partners of our Indigenous brothers and sisters in Canada makes a lot of economic sense and a lot of social sense. And it's the right thing to do. And we talk a lot about how to do that and why it makes sense, and the motivations that change when all of a sudden some Indigenous organizations, some Indigenous tribes, groups become partners in development, whether it be power lines or pipelines or real estate development or oil and gas or mineral extraction. It's their land. They've got claims at least on the land. They live on the land. They hunt on the land. They've lived there for thousands of years, and involving them in the decision-making process and as a partner in the equity from the development just makes a lot of sense. I think that that's a very powerful argument. And then on Thursday, we take it even further with Heather Exner-Perot, who is an expert on natural resources. And we talk about how important oil and gas, nuclear, coal, critical minerals are to the development of Canada and to climate change, which is, a lot of people think, an opposite kind of scenario, but it is not. We've got energy needs, and we're not going to all go to batteries tomorrow. And even if we do, we need to create the electricity. And so therefore, how do we do that in the cleanest scenario? And Heather Exner-Perot talks about that. And she also talks about some of the opposition to that in regards to environmental regulation, the Supreme Court finding that the federal government overstepped its rights fairly dramatically in natural resource extraction regulation. And she describes the policymaker of the year who she thinks was ruthless, reckless, and damaging to the environment, to the economy, and to Canada, which is kind of scary. And Friday, as usual, I go a little bit softer, and I have an incredibly interesting discussion with Leon Townsend, a family law lawyer, about her transformation, where she lost over a third of her weight, and and improved her health, improved her diet, improved her outlook, improved her relationships, improved everything about herself, and even her occupation, her job, her career. And it's a really inspirational chat. So that's my week coming up. Now let me go back to my comments about the economy and the situation we're in that Martin Peltier spoke about, I think, very well, very poignantly today. I think we got a problem. I think we have a spending problem. I think we have a revenue problem in regards to the lack of GDP growth, but our taxation above 50%, I think, is overtaxing. And there's lots of studies that say, most people, not everyone, but most people think that reasonable taxation is something that's appropriate in society, that they are willing to pay reasonable taxes to pay for the services they want and they need. But that when it gets over 50%, federal and provincial combined, and you therefore are working more for the government than you are for yourself, and this would be at the top income levels, that people lose incentives to work, they lose incentives to be productive, they lose incentives to be innovative, and they increase their incentives to move out of the country or move businesses or assets, intellectual property out of the country. And so I think that we've got a spending problem and a taxation problem more than we've got a revenue problem, even though we do have a revenue problem and lack of GDP growth, particularly GDP per capita. And that comes from a couple of things. I think that we have grown the civil service at faster than any other sector of society, and that's a mistake. I think that we have not gone back to 2019 pre-COVID levels of spending. We've sort of become used to the spending increases, not all of them, but most of them, a lot of them that were instituted during the pandemic. And I think that we've got this bad attitude that says that debt and deficits can always go up. And I'm not one who thinks you've got to balance the budget. I'm not one who thinks that you've got to go extreme in regards to, deficit reduction to zero. But I don't think the deficit can increase. Particularly, it can't increase as a percentage of GDP, and it should be constantly going down as a percentage of GDP. I've used companies as an example, and, most profitable growth-oriented companies will almost always have debt. But that debt will almost always go down as a percentage of the EBITDA, of the revenue, of the ability of the company to pay. And if it doesn't, they won't get additional debt, at least at reasonable rates from bankers. And the big benefit to companies of debt, as anyone that took Finance 101 knows, is that debt for a company is tax deductible. And so therefore it makes a lot of economic sense. Interest is not deductible for the government. And so therefore, one of the big reasons why it makes economic sense for companies to use debt is eradicated, is not there for governments. And so I think that has got to change. And I've used a couple times the example of Paul Martin and Jean Chrétien in the 1990s, and it was predicated by a crisis. And maybe you need a crisis to really bring government to attention. But as I've been reminded several times, it didn't happen right away. It took probably 2 years before the finance minister, Paul Martin, and the prime minister, Jean Chrétien, at the time realized how bad the situation was. And it was called the Canadian peso crisis because we saw the example of what happened in Mexico, first of all, and then the Canadian dollar started to dive. Government spending was cut by 20%, including health transfers to the provincial governments, things that today we would think of as sacrosanct, that we would never do. And we were in a situation where the budget was balanced and we were into surplus by the end of the 1990s, at least for a nanosecond or two. I think we need that kind of effort today. I really do. I think we are headed for a debt crisis. We are the first generation in history that are going to leave our kids with a worse financial situation than our parents left us. And I think that's a travesty. I think that's an intergenerational transfer of wealth from young people to older people that is not equitable. It's not justified. It's not right. And I think it's primarily because we've built up a debt situation And as Ron Butler will remind us of tomorrow, a debt situation that's not just national, but provincial as well, where Ontario is the most indebted subnational government in North America, if not, frankly, the world. And also personal. So we got personal debt, we got provincial debt, and we got federal debt, and it all adds up to an unsustainable situation that we need to pay attention to and we need to address. And the only way to do it is through spending cuts. Yes, we need to increase productivity. Yes, we need to increase GDP per capita. Yes, we need to increase innovation. There are all things that we need to do, which will increase revenue. But I also think we need to increase taxes, so it may not increase total revenue. But we need to cut federal, provincial, municipal, and personal spending. Bottom line. Thanks for joining me tonight. I remind you I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos are available on my website, briancrombie.com. Good night, everybody.